Old Black Engineer Astounds CEO by Revamping Obsolete, Factory Design Applauded by All. The factory floor fell silent as Maxwell Washington stood before the blueprint spread across the conference table. His weathered hands, marked by decades of engineering work, traced the outline of what everyone else in the room had already dismissed as obsolete. The CEO, Richard Kensington, watched with barely concealed impatience, his arms folded tightly across his chest. "Mr. Washington, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we've already decided. This facility is being decommissioned next month," Richard said, glancing at his watch. The board voted unanimously. Maxwell, 67 years old with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen both triumph and discrimination throughout his 40-year career, simply nodded. 3 minutes, Mr. Kensington, that's all I'm asking for." In the tense silence that followed, the moral question hanging in the air was palpable. When does experience outweigh innovation? When should we listen to voices that have been systematically ignored, even when they challenge our most certain assumptions? 3 minutes, Richard conceded, tapping his watch. Starting now. What no one in that room realized was that those 3 minutes would change everything. Not just for the factory and its 300 workers facing unemployment, but for how each person present understood value, wisdom, and the quiet dignity of being truly seen. 6 months earlier, Maxwell Washington had been preparing for retirement. His modest office at Kensington Advanced Manufacturing was being packed into cardboard boxes, each one containing memories from a career that had spanned 4 decades. Photographs of factory openings, technical awards, and team celebrations covered his desk, waiting to be carefully wrapped and taken home. Maxwell had started as a junior engineer in 1985, fighting twice as hard as his colleagues for half the recognition. He had been the first black engineer hired by the company and had watched as the manufacturing landscape transformed around him from analog to digital, from local to global, from simple production lines to complex automated systems. "Still packing up, I see," said Elena Rodriguez, the HR director, leaning against his doorframe. At 45, Elena had worked with Maxwell for over 15 years and considered him both a mentor and friend. "The retirement party committee is asking about your favorite cake." Maxwell smiled, picking up a framed photo of the company's first automated assembly line, his design. "Chocolate, but to be honest, Elena, I'm not sure I'm ready." Elena sighed, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. "I don't think the company is ready to lose you either, especially not now." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "What's happening?" "The Portland factory, Richard's planning to shut it down. Says it can't compete with the newer facilities in Asia. 300 jobs, Maxwell, mostly people who have been with us for decades." Maxwell set down the photo, his expression grave. The Portland facility had been one of the first he'd helped design, a cornerstone of the company's early growth. "That factory has been profitable for 30 years. "Not profitable enough, apparently," Elena replied. "The board meeting is next week." Richard's already got the slides prepared showing how much they'll save by moving operations overseas. Maxwell sat heavily in his chair, thinking of the workers he knew by name in Portland, families who had built their lives around that factory, communities that depended on those jobs. "Those people deserve better than a corporate slide deck deciding their fate." "I know," Elena said softly, "but what can we do? The numbers don't lie." Maxwell looked at her, a sudden determination in his eyes. "Numbers don't lie, Elena, but they don't always tell the whole truth either." That evening, instead of continuing to pack, Maxwell pulled out his old designs for the Portland facility. As the night deepened around him, he began to see possibilities that no one else had considered, not because they weren't smart enough, but because they lacked the historical knowledge, the contextual understanding that only comes with time. "I don't see why we need to drag this out," Richard Kensington said to his executive team as they gathered in the boardroom. At 42, Richard had been CEO for just 3 years, brought in by the board to modernize Kensington Advanced Manufacturing after his father's retirement. With an MBA from Harvard and experience at several tech startups, Richard believed in data-driven decisions and swift execution. "Portland numbers speak for themselves," he continued, gesturing to the projection screen where graphs showed declining profit margins. "We're operating at 22% below our newer facilities." James Chen, the chief financial officer, nodded in agreement. "The equipment is outdated and retrofitting would cost almost as much as building new. And the location doesn't make sense anymore," added Melissa Park, head of global operations. "We need to be closer to our supply chain in Asia." Richard smiled tightly, pleased with the consensus. Then we're agreed. We'll announce the closure next week and begin the transition immediately. A knock on the door interrupted them. Richard frowned as his assistant entered. I'm sorry, Mr. Kensington, but Maxwell Washington is here. He says it's urgent. Richard sighed. We're in the middle of something, Diane. He says it's about Portland, she replied, her expression suggesting that Maxwell had been insistent. The executives exchanged glances. Maxwell Washington was a company legend, but also in Richard's mind, a relic of the past, respected but not necessarily relevant to modern manufacturing challenges. Fine, Richard said. Send him in. Maxwell entered carrying a thick folder and a tablet. His formal attire, a pressed suit that he usually reserved for client meetings, indicated the seriousness with which he approached this impromptu meeting. Mr. Washington, Richard greeted him with professional courtesy but clear impatience. We're discussing the Portland facility. I understand you have something to add. Maxwell nodded, placing his materials on the table. I do. I believe closing Portland would be a significant mistake, not just morally, but financially. Richard raised an eyebrow. We've analyzed the numbers extensively. I'm sure you have, Maxwell replied evenly. But I've spent the last 2 weeks reviewing them as well, and I believe there's an alternative that hasn't been considered. He opened his folder, revealing detailed schematics. Portland isn't obsolete, it's underutilized. The facility was originally designed with expansion capabilities that were never fully implemented. For the next 20 minutes, Maxwell walked them through his proposal, a hybrid redesign that would maintain the facility's existing strengths while incorporating new technologies. His plan didn't ignore the realities of global manufacturing, but suggested a specialization approach that would make Portland essential rather than expendable. As he finished, the room remained silent. Richard studied Maxwell, trying to reconcile the innovative proposal with his preconception of the older engineer as someone resistant to change. This is interesting, Richard finally said. But how can you be sure these modifications would achieve the efficiency targets we need? Maxwell met his gaze directly. Because I designed the original system, Mr. Kensington, I know its potential better than anyone. James Chen leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. The initial investment would still be substantial. Less than the cost of building new overseas, Maxwell countered, and without the disruption to our supply chain or the loss of our experienced workforce. Richard frowned, torn between dismissing the proposal outright and acknowledging its potential merit. We can't make decisions based on sentimentality. I'm not asking you to, Maxwell replied calmly. I'm asking you to consider all the variables, including the value of institutional knowledge and community goodwill, which do affect the bottom line, even if they're harder to quantify on a spreadsheet. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard had built his reputation on being decisive, on making the tough calls that older executives hesitated to make. Changing course now would require him to admit that his initial assessment had been incomplete. I'll need time to review this, Richard said finally, a minimal concession. Maxwell nodded, gathering his materials. Of course, but time is one thing the Portland employees don't have much of right now. As Maxwell left, the executive team exchanged uncomfortable glances. His words hung in the air, challenging not just their decision about Portland, but their entire approach to leadership and progress. Over the following weeks, tensions within the company grew. Word had spread about Maxwell's intervention, creating a division between those who supported his vision and those who believed Richard's approach was necessary for the company's survival in a competitive global market. Alina found Maxwell in the company archives, surrounded by dusty blueprints and facility reports. You've started a rebellion, she said, only half joking. The Portland team has been calling non-stop, asking for updates. Maxwell looked up, fatigue evident in his eyes. And what does Richard say? Nothing officially, but he's assembled a task force to evaluate your proposal. James Chen is leading it. Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. James was analytical but fair, a good sign. And unofficially, Alina sat beside him. He's frustrated. You've challenged him publicly, something no one's done before, but I think you've also made him curious. It's not about challenging Richard, Maxwell said, spreading out another blueprint. It's about doing right by the people who built this company. I know that, Alina replied. But does Richard? Maxwell's response was interrupted by his phone ringing. It was James Chen requesting his presence at a meeting that afternoon. The task force wanted to ask some questions. The meeting was held in a small conference room away from the executive offices. James had assembled a team of engineers, financial analysts, and operations specialists. Richard was notably absent. We've been reviewing your proposal, Mr. Washington. James began formally. "There are some aspects we'd like to clarify." What followed was 3 hours of detailed questioning, with Maxwell defending every aspect of his plan. The younger engineers were particularly skeptical, suggesting that his approach was outdated. "With respect, sir," said Tara Wilson, a talented engineer in her early 30s, "your design doesn't fully account for the latest automation protocols." Maxwell smiled, recognizing in her the same ambition and certainty he had once possessed. "Actually, Ms. Wilson, if you look at Section 4.3, you'll see that I've incorporated adaptive learning systems that go beyond current automation standards." Tara blinked in surprise as she reviewed the section. This isn't in our current playbook." "No," Maxwell agreed, "because it's based on research I've been following that hasn't made it into the corporate guidelines yet." The dynamic in the room subtly shifted. The younger team members began asking different questions, not challenging his competence, but genuinely curious about his insights. By the meeting's end, James's expression had changed from skeptical to thoughtful. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Washington. We'll continue our evaluation." As Maxwell gathered his materials, James held back, waiting until the others had left. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Maxwell nodded. "Why fight so hard for this? You're retiring soon. This won't affect your legacy." Maxwell considered the question carefully. "When I started here, James, I was often the only person in the room who looked like me. I had to fight to be heard to prove my ideas were valid. But what kept me going wasn't just professional pride, it was knowing that my designs created jobs, supported families, built communities." He paused, making sure James understood. "The people in Portland deserve someone fighting for them, someone who sees their value beyond a line item on a budget. If that's part of my legacy, I'll be satisfied." James didn't respond immediately, absorbing Maxwell's words. Finally, he said, "Our report goes to Richard tomorrow. I can't promise anything." "I know," Maxwell replied. "I just ask that you be thorough." Richard Kensington stared out his office window, the task force report open on his desk. The evaluation was more positive than he had expected, suggesting that Maxwell's proposal deserved serious consideration. It challenged many of his assumptions about the Portland facility's viability. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was his father, William Kensington, the company's former CEO and chairman emeritus. "Dad," Richard said, surprised, "I didn't know you were coming in today." William, now in his 70s but still commanding respect with his presence, settled into a chair. "Thought I'd check in. Heard there's some debate about Portland." Richard tensed slightly. His relationship with his father had always been complicated admiration mixed with the pressure of living up to his legacy. "We're handling it," William nodded, studying his son. "Maxwell Washington involved, I hear." "He's presented an alternative proposal," Richard acknowledged, trying to keep his tone neutral. "The task force thinks it has merit." "And what do you think?" Richard hesitated. "His approach is unconventional. It doesn't align with our global strategy." William smiled slightly. "You know, when Maxwell first came to us with his ideas for automating the original assembly lines, I had the same concern. Seemed risky, unnecessary, but I took a chance on him. Times are different now, Dad. We're facing global competition that you didn't have to deal with. The challenges change, son. The principles don't." William leaned forward. "Maxwell sees things differently because his path has been different. That perspective has value, especially when everyone else is looking in the same direction." Richard felt a flicker of irritation. "Are you saying I should ignore the data?" "I'm saying data isn't everything," William replied calmly. "Some of the best decisions I made weren't the ones that looked best on paper at the time." After his father left, Richard remained at his desk, conflicted. The rational, data-driven approach that had defined his career pointed one way, but something about Maxwell's conviction and his father's words pulled him in another direction. Finally, he made a decision. He would go to Portland himself, see the facility firsthand, and then meet with Maxwell one last time before making his final decision. The Portland facility was larger than Richard remembered from his last visit years ago. As he walked the floor with the plant manager, Sarah Thompson, he was struck by the obvious age of some equipment, but also by the smooth efficiency of the operation. "Most of our team has been here over 15 years, Sarah explained as they observed a complex assembly sequence. "They know this system inside and out." Richard nodded, noting the easy communication between workers, the small adjustments they made without needing to consult manuals or supervisors. "And what do they think about possibly modernizing?" Sarah gave him a measured look. "They're not resistant to change, Mr. Kensington. They just want to be part of it, not casualties of it." That afternoon, Richard met with several long-time employees, asking questions and listening more than he spoke. One conversation particularly affected him with Joe Ramirez, a floor supervisor who had started as a line worker 30 years earlier. "This place put my kids through college," Joe told him proudly. "My daughter's an engineer now because she grew up watching what we build here." By the time Richard returned to headquarters the following day, his perspective had shifted. He requested a final presentation from Maxwell with the entire executive team present. And so it came to this moment, Maxwell standing before the blueprint in the conference room, the CEO and executives watching with varying degrees of skepticism and interest, 3 minutes on the clock to make his case. "The Portland facility isn't obsolete," Maxwell began, his voice steady and confident. "It's incomplete." He pointed to specific sections of the blueprint. "When we designed this in the 90s, we included infrastructure for expansions that were ahead of their time. The foundation is already there, we just need to build on it." Richard frowned. "Our analysis shows your analysis is based on what Portland is now, not what it could be," Maxwell interrupted respectfully but firmly. "The facility was designed to evolve." He pulled up comparative projections on his tablet. "With the modifications I've outlined, Portland won't just match your overseas projections, it will exceed them within 18 months. And we'll retain the workforce that knows our systems better than anyone else could." Richard studied the numbers. "Even if these projections are accurate, the initial investment is substantial." "Yes," Maxwell agreed. "But consider the hidden costs of relocation, supply chain disruptions, quality control issues during transition, loss of institutional knowledge, community goodwill. Those don't show up neatly on balance sheets, but they affect the bottom line nonetheless." Paused, looking each executive in the eye. "And there's something else that's harder to quantify, but just as real, the message we send about what we value. Are we a company that discards people and places when they no longer fit our spreadsheet projections? Or are we one that invests in them, that sees potential where others see problems?" The room was silent as his 3 minutes ended. Richard stood up, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. We'll need to discuss this privately." Maxwell gathered his materials, preparing to leave. Before he reached the door, Richard spoke again. "One more question. Why are you pushing so hard for this when you're retiring next month? This won't affect you personally." Maxwell turned back. "Because 40 years ago, someone took a chance on me when they didn't have to. They saw potential that others missed." He smiled slightly. "I'm just paying it forward." As the door closed behind him, Maxwell knew he had done all he could. The decision now rested with Richard and the board. 3 days later, the entire company received an email announcing a special town hall meeting. Rumors spread quickly, most assuming it would be the official announcement of Portland's closure. The company auditorium was packed with video links established to all facilities, including Portland. Richard took the stage, his expression serious. "As many of you know, we've been evaluating the future of our Portland manufacturing facility," he began. "Today, I want to share our decision and the reasoning behind it." In the audience, Maxwell sat beside Alina, prepared for disappointment but at peace with having fought the good fight. Richard continued. "The data initially suggested that closing Portland was the most financially sound decision." He paused. "But data, while essential, doesn't tell the whole story." A murmur ran through the crowd as Richard gestured to the screen behind him, where Maxwell's redesign appeared. "Thanks to the insights and persistence of one of our most experienced engineers, we've discovered an alternative approach." Over the next 20 minutes, Richard outlined a modified version of Maxwell's proposal, a comprehensive modernization of Portland that would make it a specialized hub within their global network. "This represents a significant investment," Richard acknowledged, "but one that honors our company's heritage while positioning us for the future. Portland won't just remain open, it will become a model for how traditional manufacturing can evolve rather than be abandoned." The announcement was met with applause, loudest from the Portland video feed, where workers embraced each other in relief and celebration. Richard raised his hand for quiet. "I want to recognize the person whose vision and persistence made this possible. Maxwell Washington has demonstrated that experience and innovation are not opposing forces, but complementary strengths." He gestured for Maxwell to join him on stage. Surprised, Maxwell made his way forward as the applause grew. "Mr. Washington has been with Kensington for 40 years, Richard continued. "He was scheduled to retire next month. However, I'm pleased to announce that he has agreed to delay his retirement to oversee the Portland transformation as Special Project Director." The ovation was deafening. Maxwell, momentarily overwhelmed, shook Richard's offered hand. "Thank you for making me see what I was missing," Richard said quietly, audible only to Maxwell over the applause. "Thank you for being willing to look again," Maxwell replied. The transformation of the Portland facility began immediately. Maxwell assembled a team that intentionally paired experienced workers with younger engineers, creating a knowledge transfer that benefited both groups. Tara Wilson, who had challenged him in the task force meeting, became one of his most valuable collaborators. "I never thought I'd be saying this," she admitted to him after a particularly productive session, "but I've learned more in these 3 months than in my last 3 years." Maxwell smiled. "That's because you're finally listening to the people who built these systems, not just the manuals that describe them." The project wasn't without challenges. Budget constraints required creative solutions, and some technologies proved more difficult to integrate than anticipated. There were moments when even Maxwell questioned whether they could meet the ambitious goals they had set. 4 months into the project, Richard visited Portland to check on their progress. He found Maxwell in what had become the Innovation Lab, working late with a group that spanned 3 generations of company employees. "How are we doing?" Richard asked after the others had left for the evening. Maxwell gestured to the prototype assembly line they were reconfiguring. "Behind schedule on this section, but ahead on the automation integration. Overall on track." Richard nodded, studying the older man with newfound respect. "You know, when you first presented this plan, I thought you were just trying to save jobs out of sentiment. And now I think you saw possibilities that the rest of us missed because we were too busy looking forward to look around." Richard smiled slightly. "My father suggested as much." Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "Yum always did have good instincts. He said something else too," Richard added. "That sometimes the most innovative thinking comes from those who have had to find different paths to the same destination." Maxwell considered this. "There's truth in that. When you've had to navigate around barriers that others haven't faced, you develop a different perspective on what's possible." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about how to capture that perspective more systematically in our company. Diversity isn't just a moral imperative, it's a competitive advantage." "It is," Maxwell agreed, "but only if diverse voices are actually heard and respected, not just present." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like your input on how we might do better there." As they walked through the partially renovated facility, Maxwell realized that something unexpected had emerged from this project. A bridge between generations and approaches that might ultimately be as valuable as the technical innovations themselves. 6 months to the day after Maxwell's 3-minute presentation, the renovated Portland facility was ready for its official relaunch. The transformation was remarkable, a blend of heritage equipment upgraded with cutting-edge technology, operated by a workforce that combined decades of experience with fresh perspectives. The ceremony drew attention beyond the company. Local officials attended, grateful for the preserved jobs and renewed investment in the community. Industry press covered the event, intrigued by the unconventional approach to modernization. As Maxwell prepared to cut the ribbon alongside Richard, he reflected on the journey. What had begun as a last stand before retirement had become something more, a testament to the value of experience, the importance of being heard, and the power of challenging assumptions. Richard addressed the gathered crowd. "Today represents more than the reopening of a factory. It represents a recommitment to the idea that progress doesn't always mean starting over. Sometimes it means building on the foundations we already have, both technological and human." He turned to Maxwell. "None of this would have happened without one person who refused to accept that obsolete was the end of the story." Maxwell Washington saw potential where others saw only problems, and he had the courage and persistence to make us see it too. The applause was genuine and heartfelt. As Maxwell stepped forward to speak, he looked out at the faces, the Portland workers whose jobs had been saved, the young engineers who had gained new respect for experience, the executives who had been willing to reconsider their assumptions. "When I joined this company 40 years ago," Maxwell began, "I had to fight to be heard. Today, I'm grateful that when it mattered most, you listened." He gestured to the facility behind him. "What we've created here isn't just a more efficient factory. It's a model for how we might bridge divides between old and new, between different perspectives and experiences. It's proof that we're stronger when we value all voices." After the ceremony, as workers and visitors toured the renovated facility, Alina found Maxwell standing quietly at the edge of the production floor, watching the smooth operation of a system that combined his original design with the latest innovations. "So," she said, "still planning to retire next month?" Maxwell smiled. "Eventually, but there's a mentorship program I want to get off the ground first. Too many young engineers who could benefit from the kind of guidance I never had." Alina nodded, understanding. "And too many experienced workers whose knowledge shouldn't be lost." Exactly. Maxwell watched as Tara demonstrated a feature to some visitors, her explanation acknowledging both the historical design elements and the new technologies. Besides, I'm not quite ready to stop learning yet. As they stood there, Richard approached, accompanied by his father, William. Quite something, isn't it? William said, looking around with appreciation. Reminds me of why we got into manufacturing in the first place, to build things that last. Richard nodded, his expression reflective. I've been thinking about what you said, Maxwell, about seeing potential where others see problems. We're implementing that philosophy company-wide now. That's good to hear, Maxwell replied. We're also establishing a new position, Richard continued. Chief of Engineering Innovation. It would involve mentoring special projects, bridging between our traditional operations and new technologies. He looked at Maxwell directly. I'd like you to consider it. Maxwell was surprised. That doesn't sound like retirement, William chuckled. Trust me, retirement is overrated. Better to keep doing what gives you purpose. As they discussed the possibilities, Maxwell realized that what had begun as a fight to save one factory had evolved into something more significant. A recalibration of how the company valued experience, wisdom, and diverse perspectives. Later, as the event wound down, Maxwell found himself alone in the control room of the newly renovated facility. He ran his hand along a console that contained elements of his original design, now integrated with systems that hadn't existed when he began his career. In that moment, he understood that his true legacy wasn't in the machines or buildings he had helped create, but in the shift in thinking he had inspired a recognition that progress isn't always about discarding the old for the new, but about finding the wisdom to know what to preserve, what to transform, and how to value the human knowledge that no algorithm could replace. As he prepared to leave, Maxwell noticed a plaque that hadn't been there earlier. It was small, mounted beside the main control panel, and it read, "The Washington Integration System, where experience meets innovation." He smiled, touched by the recognition, but even more by what it represented, not just for him, but for everyone whose voice deserved to be heard, whose experience contained wisdom that might otherwise be overlooked, whose perspective might reveal possibilities that others couldn't see. Outside, the lights of Portland shone in the evening sky, a community still viable, still moving forward. Maxwell Washington walked toward them, not at the end of his journey, but at the beginning of an unexpected new chapter. Behind him, the factory hummed with renewed purpose, a testament to the power of seeing potential where others see only obsolescence, and to the courage it takes to stand up for that vision, even when time appears to be running out. 3 minutes, he murmured to himself with a smile, remembering Richard's initial reluctance. Sometimes that's all you need to change everything. Clapper board, if you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to Preciphistories for more narratives that explore the depth of human experience and the wisdom we can gain from it. Your support helps us continue creating content that matters. How has someone's experience or perspective changed your understanding of what's possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we build a community of deeper understanding. Remember, sometimes the greatest innovations come not from discarding the past, but from seeing its untapped potential. What obsolete ideas might deserve a second look in your life?